Hi, B20 section 8.2, all about the blood today. So we're looking at the parts of blood to start with. It has the liquid portion that's got all the dissolved gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as wastes, vitamins, minerals, hormones, all those things. And as well, we've got the red cells, white cells, and the platelets used for clotting. In this graph, you can see some of the characteristics of the cells that we have. Red blood cells that live about 3 months, white blood cells really for your immune system, living an average of a couple of days. And then we have platelets that also live a few days, but they are specifically basically little cell fragments, really tiny, and they are used in the clotting reaction. White blood cells, there's a number of types, more than even this graph shows, but in general they are used for the immune response in some way or another, and we'll have a whole topic on that on 8.3. Reds, though, they carry oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they are very obviously the most numerous. So we're talking about an average of 4 or 5 million red blood cells in your body. The other name for red blood cells is erythrocytes, and they are, the reds are 44% of your blood volume. I think I had a picture of a hematocrit here that shows you in a vial. Sorry, I thought it was right there, but I guess not. Oh, there it is. In a vial, how much of it is white blood cells? That's the little part in there. Red blood cells, this very large amount, and how much of it is plasma. So around 45% being the reds and maybe 50% or so being the plasma. It says 55% here, 56%. So that's kind of gives you an idea how much of each component is in the blood. Now, red blood cells are those interesting cells that have no nucleus. They kind of look like this, and that is showing you that there's a dip in it, so it's kind of thin in the center, but it's not a donut hole. There's not a hole in the center. It's just a dip in the center. It's just the way it's structured, and it has no nucleus, so that it has more space in there to carry, like the whole cell can carry a whole lot of oxygen. And if you're wondering, without a nucleus, how can it reproduce? It specifically doesn't reproduce, but it's got stem cells in your bones, and in the bones, in the bone marrow, there are stem cells that will be able to make red blood cells and reproduce them. The hemoglobin inside, we use the abbreviation HB for hemoglobin, is what attaches to oxygen, and it can carry that oxygen to all the cells of the body and pick up some carbon dioxide. But we remember that from our last chapter, a lot of carbon dioxide is carried by the bicarbonate ions, so we don't want to forget about that. If you are low on hemoglobin or low on red blood cells, then you will have an oxygen deficiency and look kind of pale with less red blood cells, and that's called anemia. Sometimes it's a deficiency in iron, because hemoglobin is made of iron, and so if there's a deficiency in iron, then you will not make enough red blood cells either. Also, if you have a problem with your carrying oxygen and it's because of a misshapen red blood cell, like this in the shape of a sickle, that's called sickle cell anemia. And of course, it's not carrying as much oxygen if it's not the full shape as the normal one here. The other issue with sickle cells is that they can get sort of lodged in little capillaries and cause tiny little clots everywhere in the body. And so it's a pretty serious, especially if it's not treated. Those clots can accumulate to cause some very early death and some serious issues with organs and brain damage. So yeah, next thing, white blood cells. So reds were erythrocytes, whites are leukocytes. And leukocytes, very small amount of your blood is the white blood cells, but basically they go up in number when you are activating your immune response because of some invading viruses, bacteria, or parasites, or foreign cells of any kind. And you can see that there's several different kinds. We won't have to really memorize all of these: neutrophils, eosinophils, the granular ones, monocytes, are other kinds that are they engulf or basically phagocytize or eat bacteria. Those are ones you're going to hear more about later. These granulocytes, they also are part of immune response that you'll hear about a bit later. But really, it's all about kind of being the soldiers for invaders into your body. Lymphocytes, these are made in your lymphatic system, which we'll talk about soon as well. But the lymphocytes are white blood cells that help make antibodies, which are little chemicals that stick together bacteria or bad molecules like pathogens, viruses, bacteria, helps to stick them together. So lymphocytes make those antibodies. These specific sequence of events in the lymphatics or in the immune response will be something we talk about in 18.3. So platelets are next. These are little fragments of cells, and they do not have a nucleus either, so they are formed from the bone marrow as well. But their clotting reaction that happens is that we're trying to stop a bleed somewhere in the body. So if you've had a cut and it stopped bleeding, that's because these fibers were formed and they stopped the blood cells from leaking out. Those fibers are called fibrin, and they are formed from this inactive molecule called fibrinogen. So I always think of the clotting reaction from how fibrinogen turns to fibrin, and in order for that to happen, the molecule prothrombin, which is the inactive thrombin, turns into thrombin. So when prothrombin turns into thrombin, it causes fibrinogen to turn into fibrin. So those four parts of our clotting reaction happen with inactive molecules because you don't want clots to be there all the time, or you would have strokes and heart attacks and blockages everywhere. So there's like 3 molecules that are there waiting for a need for fibrin, and when there's a sharp edge that is noticed, then prothrombin turns to thrombin, fibrinogen turns to fibrin, and it stops. That sharp edge means that there's a break in the vessel somewhere, and if you've ever had a bruise somewhere, that is a spot where a blood vessel was broken, and a clot like this clotting reaction would have happened to seal that cut or break in the blood vessel. The bluish turns into like greenish and eventually goes away because your body just recycles the leaked out blood and closes up that blood vessel. And so our clot functions in that way. One thing you'll notice here too is that you have calcium involved. And interestingly, calcium is involved in quite a few reactions in our human body systems. We will see calcium involved in muscle contraction coming up in chapter 10. We see calcium involved in, the clotting reaction. As well, calcium is involved in nervous system nerve transmission, which is discussed in Bio 30. So lots of uses for calcium in the body. Take a look at these video links. They're excellent. A clot can be called a thrombus, or if it's moving through your blood vessels, it can be called an embolus, and can cause all sorts of serious things like bursting blood vessels in the lungs, which is pulmonary embolism, or in the heart, coronary, and so these are even brain aneurysms. So there's lots of serious possible side effects, serious effects of clots. So this is a review talking about how a lot of carbon dioxide is carried as a bicarbonate ion, and this one is talking about how we have body temperature staying at 37 degrees and being homeostatically controlled by the movement of blood through your blood vessels, and how if you have a temperature going too high, then the blood vessels will dilate so that those blood vessels will come closer to the surface of your skin everywhere to cool off. If you are too cold, those blood vessels contract and they go like basically sink deeper into your like arm, and they're able to warm up. On top of that, we've got the perspiring if you're too warm, and shivering, which is little muscle contractions to help warm you up if you are too cold. So there's like a lot of mechanisms in place to help regulate your body temperature. So too warm, when you dilate those vessels, they come closer to dissipate heat. If you're too cold, they contract back to stay warm. Which is exactly what this is talking about, except it also mentions the couple of chemicals that can cause vasodilation and cause you to be like flushed, like nicotine or alcohol, as well as if you're exercising, some people get red in the face or flushed because your body temperature is going up with all the muscle contraction going on, and those vessels dilate to come to the surface to try to cool off. This countercurrent exchange is just looking at how blood that's warmer is like sending its heat to blood vessels that are cooler, and so together that's keeping your body temperature more balanced. Capillaries, the tiniest vessels, are, it says we have about 1 billion of them in the body, and what happens is they have some little sphincters or closures, and so that means that in some places they will be closed until we need more blood to that area and they'll open. So an example is, for example, if someone says I'm a weightlifter going in a photo shoot, so I'm going to go pump up my muscles. The muscles aren't actually getting bigger, but what's happening when you start working those muscles is that they need more oxygen. So those little capillaries in there that were closed by little valves or little what they call little what did we call them here? Little closures, and they will open up, and they will allow the blood to go into those areas, and otherwise they would stay closed until needed. So sphincters is the word I'm looking for. And so someone pumping up their biceps for a photo shoot or something, basically working that muscle will open these sphincters, blood will go to the area, and basically more blood to the bicep is what is making it look bigger. So those aren't always open, they're just open when they're needed. Okay, so this one's talking about interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid. That's the same thing, that is around all the cells, and capillaries will be carrying materials to cells, and those materials like nutrients or oxygen will go through that cellular fluid and then into cells. And so there's diffusion that will go from your blood vessel into the oxygen, will go into the fluid around there and then into the cell after that, and same with going backwards. blood was going in one direction. We know all about that. This is showing the extracellular fluid that materials will go through before they go from cells through the fluid into the blood vessels, or from blood vessels through the fluid and then into cells. I think that wraps up the functions. We have a couple of blood disorders that are mentioned here. Hemophilia is when the blood clotting proteins are not all functioning or there, and so without clotting, the bleeding that can happen from a simple bruise or injury could be life-threatening, and so they have to give the missing proteins to people with hemophilia. Leukemia is a cancer of white blood cells, and there's several different kinds depending on which white blood cell is affected. And the leukemia may involve transfusions, chemotherapy, or even bone marrow transplant to replace the bone marrow with functioning cells that will make proper white blood cells. This is showing you that what we call a hematocrit, which is a normal amount of white or red blood cells, white blood cells, and plasma, compared to someone who has anemia and a low amount of reds. The blood just fills up with plasma then. Or if you have a really high amount of reds, polycythemia. Incidentally, on that same idea, if you go to higher elevations, you can get more red blood cells produced because of the low amount of oxygen. Your body responds by making more red blood cells to catch any oxygen that there is possible, which is why high altitude training was done by some people like training for certain sports events. I think it's illegal now, but high altitude training had them bump up their amounts of red blood cells, which then they realized they could just take out and remove blood from their body and keep it and put it back in just before their event, which is called blood doping. And that was doing a similar thing, upping their amount of red blood cells, which means they could carry more oxygen and excel at their sport, which in both cases, those are considered illegal. But here's a picture of someone's red blood cells and white or plasma right there. You can't really see the white blood cells. They would be in a zone right there. If you spin or centrifuge your blood, it'll layer up just like that. A couple cool links to take a look at. Here you can see the comparison of what red blood cells look like normally compared to how big the white blood cells. There aren't as many whites, but they are bigger, and most of them are multinucleated, mini nucleus. The red blood cells are so thin in the middle, they almost look like they are white in the center, but that's just because light is getting through. These little speckles in here would be the platelets, little cell fragments that are there in case we need to do clotting. So this was human. This one here is frog blood, and you can see frog blood is different in that the red blood cells do have a nucleus and can reproduce, so it's just a little bit different in frogs. This picture is one with sleeping sickness or malaria. This is a parasite that's invaded into the red blood cells. You can see the parasite inside, and that's what gives someone sleeping sickness. Leukemia, and compared to like the view that had two white blood cells, these are stained so they look purple, but here you can see many white blood cells, and that's an indication that there's a cancer of the whites and they're reproducing in high numbers. And basically when cancerous cells reproduce, they're reproducing and not functioning, so they're not actually helping with your immune response, but they're taking up place of the reds that you would normally have there. So it is not ideal for the body. Anemia, these are really very light looking reds, so there's some iron deficiency there. This one is sickle cell, so you can see these red blood cells are like flat looking, basically sickle shaped, like that one there, and could easily cause little clots in the blood vessels. Mono is too many whites, but also some strange like clumping of the red blood cells can happen, and that's from a virus. And that wraps up our little video lesson on 8.2 today. And I thank you for joining me, and I will see you for 8.3.